Hello everyone. In this tutorial, we will set up our environment to start developing using the Python language. So what we will be doing is to first install a code editor. A code editor is simply a software that we use to write and run our programs or our source code. Right, and then we will install the Python interpreter, which we'll talk about in a minute. And third, we will install the Python extension, which also we will talk about in a minute. So the code editor we will be utilizing is called VS Code or Visual Studio Code, developed by Microsoft, which again we will use to write our code. And the main features supported by this code editor is first debugging, which is basically a sub program or utility that aids us in spotting issues or bugs in our code and help us fix them up. Second, we have the feature of syntax highlighting, which is basically the coloring of the different keywords and terms in our code. For example, the if keyword in Python and for and break will all be colored in red, for example. String values, like for example, hello, will be colored in orange. Functions like print will be colored in yellow, and so on and so forth, in addition to many other similar features. Third feature is code completion, which is basically a feature that helps us complete our code or suggests certain uh, uh, functions or features for us whenever we start writing certain characters. So, for example, if we wrote down BRI, VS Code will automatically suggest function names and other items that start with these three characters, like print, right? So we can select them much faster, and this basically expedites the process of code development. And fourth feature is adding extensions. We will be adding certain extensions in order to add extra functionality to the ones supported by default by VS Code. Okay. Uh, as we mentioned, we will be installing the Python interpreter. Basically, the interpreter is the program responsible for evaluating and executing the code written in a particular high-level language like Python, keeping in mind that there is an interpreter for each specific language. So we have an interpreter for the Python language, we have an interpreter for Ruby language, PHP language, JavaScript language, and every other interpreted language. So again, in this case, we'll be using the Python interpreter. The interpreter takes a simple program or any program and executes it to produce certain output. So for example, this program creates a variable and stores the string value hello world inside it, and then it simply prints out the message variable. In this case, we will be getting the hello world text in our standard output device, or simply display. So starting with installing the VS Code editor, we simply go to Google and type VS Code install, right? And then we go to the main page, and here we can see different links depending on the operating system of your computer. So we have a link for Windows, one for Linux, and one for Apple, right? Or Mac OS X. So in our case, I'm using a Windows system, so I've installed the Windows version. The process is very straightforward, so go ahead and do it on your own. And since it takes quite some time, I've already installed the editor on my system. The second thing is to install the Python interpreter. So we simply go to Google and type download and install Python. And as you can see, there are so many versions of the Python interpreter, where each version is basically an enhancement on its predecessors, right? Like feature additions, bug fixes, etc., etc. Now, some versions are more stable than others. one of those stable versions is 3.7.6, which will be the one that we'll be using throughout this series and probably in upcoming series. So let's search for this particular version, 3.7.6. Click on it. And down here we can see different links depending on your preference, right? In my case, since I'm using an x86-64 system, I will be using this link, the Windows x68-64 executable installer. Now, how can we get this information? I have referred to the system information page on my system. As you can see, it's x64 based PC. So x86 64 is the same as x64, right? We have x86 32 for 30-bit systems. So again, it depends on your system. Make sure to verify the correct specifications and then navigate to the proper link. So I have already downloaded the installer on my system. So all I have to do now is to go to my downloads page and click on the installer. Make sure to check this box, add Python 3.7 to path. Path is basically a variable that stores values that can be globally accessed by other softwares on your computer, right? So we want to add the path to the interpreter to this particular variable so that softwares like VS Code can easily locate this interpreter whenever we want to run certain programs. So we check this box and we click install now. All right, so the setup or the installation of the Python interpreter, as we can see, was successful. So now we are ready to create our first program. So we navigate to VS Code and we simply open up a new file, right? Let's select a text file initially. And now let's click on Save As to save this file as a Python file. And this is important. So let's name it test, for example, right? And then Save As type, we select Python, right? With the .py extension. So let's search for Python here. Python. There you go. Now we save up the file, keeping in mind that we saved it as .py or as a Python file so that VS Code interpret this file as a Python code, and therefore it will be using the correct Python extension and the correct Python interpreter whenever we run our code, right? Okay. Now, now that we have saved up our Python file, let's go ahead and add the Python extension, which supports certain features like debugging and syntax highlighting, among other things. So we go to the extensions tab, right? And we search for an extension called Python, which will be this one, right? So you click on install and install the extension on your in your VS Code, right? After that, we go back to our file and we start writing our program. Now, take a look here. As you can see from here, we can select the appropriate interpreter we want to use for interpreting our Python programs. So we have multiple ones here, but we will be using the one that we have installed for 5 minutes ago, right? Which will be this one. Okay, now let's go ahead and write a simple program, which is a program that simply adds two variables together and then print out the results. So you can say num1 is equal to 2, num2 is equal to 4, and then print out the addition of those two numbers. Now look how the editor, with the assistance of the extension, have produced some suggestions in this tab, like print, property, precall, pread, etc., etc., depending on the characters that we have initially entered, right? This is not possible without the extension that we just installed. Okay, so we want to use the print function, right? And then we will be saying num1 plus num2. Now you can create a third variable and store the sum of those numbers rather than doing it inside the print function, but that's completely fine. Now we click here on the Run Python File button, and this terminal appears up to display the outputs of our program, which is in this case 6. Right? Now you're basically ready to start developing using Python. Again, all we did is that we installed the VS Code, then we installed the Python interpreter version 3.7.6, and then we installed the Python extension, which is this one. There are two, so make sure you select the correct one. Right? After that, you create a new file with the extension .py so that VS Code can interpret it as a Python file to navigate to the correct interpreter and extension. After that, you start developing your programs and run your output. All right. In the next tutorials, we will start our introduction to the Python language. We will be creating numerous programs, so make sure your environment is all set before you proceed further. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you the next time.